Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up, you guys? Yes, so sorry. We're reading Crime and Punishment, Part 2, Chapter 1. I'm experiencing the full effect of the greenhouse effect in my car. So I had to pop a window open. So I'm probably going to be talking a little bit more quietly as to not let the other people hear me. Okay. He lay like that for a very long time. From time to time, he seemed to wake up, and then he noticed that it was long since night. But it never occurred to him to rise. At last, he noticed that it was daylight. He was lying stretched out on the couch, still numb from his recent oblivion. The terrible, desperate shouts that he heard every night under his window after 2 o'clock came to him, now sharp as a knife from the street. That was what wakened him. The drunks are coming out of the saloons, he thought. It's after 2. Suddenly, he leaped up, as though he had been ripped from the couch. What, after 2? He sat down again on the couch, and then he remembered everything. In a single flash, he suddenly remembered everything. At the first moment, he thought he would go mad. A terrible chill seized him, but the chill was from a fever that had begun some time ago in his sleep. Now, though, such a fit of shivering suddenly struck him that he all but felt his teeth jarred loose, and he trembled and shook all over. He opened the door and listened. Everyone in the house was sound asleep. He looked at himself, he looked at everything in the room around him, and he was amazed. How could he have come in like that yesterday without putting the door on the hook, flinging himself down on the couch, not only undressing, but with his hat on? It had fallen off and lay on the floor near his pillow. If anyone had come in, what would he have thought? That I was drunk, but he hurried to the window. The light was sufficient, and he examined himself hastily from head to foot, all his clothes. Were there any traces? That was no way to go about it, though. Shaking and shivering, he took off all his clothes and examined them all over once more. He turned everything inside out, scrutinized every thread and patch, and since he did not trust himself, repeated the process about 3 times. But there seemed to be nothing, no traces. Only in one place, where his trousers had been badly frayed, some thick traces of dried blood clung to the frayed edge. He seized his large clasp knife and cut off the frayed edge. That seemed to be all there was. Suddenly he remembered that the purse had all the things he had taken out of the old woman's chest had been in his pockets all along. He had not even thought of removing and concealing them before this. He had not even thought of it while examining his clothes. What was the matter with them? In a flash, he hastened to take them out and spread them on the table. He spread them all out and even turned his pocket inside out to make sure nothing was left. Then he collected everything in a heap and carried it into a corner. There, in that very corner, down toward the floor, the wallpaper had come unstuck from the wall and was torn in one place. He immediately began to stuff everything into this hole behind the paper. Made it! Everything is out of sight. The purse, too, he thought joyfully, and he stood there staring blankly into the corner at the hole, which bulged out more now. Suddenly he started with the horror. My God, he whispered desperately. What's the matter with me? Do I call that hidden? Is that a way to hide things? True, he had thought there would be only money and had not counted on the things, and so he had not prepared a place ahead of time. But now, what was there for me to be so pleased about just now, he thought. Is that a way to go about hiding things? My intelligence has really left me. He sat down helplessly on the couch, and an unbearable fit of shivering shook him again immediately. With a mechanical gesture, he reached for what had once been a student's greatcoat lying on a chair nearby. It was still warm, but almost in shreds. He covered himself with it, and instantly sleep and fever together possessed him again. He sank into oblivion. Not more than about 5 minutes had passed, however, when he leaped up and began rushing in a frenzy to his clothes again. How could I go back to sleep when nothing has been done? That's it, the sling under the armhole. I haven't removed it yet. I forgot, it's evidence. He ripped the sling off and tore it into little pieces as quickly as he could, stuffing them into the laundry under his pillow. Pieces of torn linen are not suspicious anyway. Yes, apparently not, he repeated. Standing in the middle of the room with a tension that amounted to pain, he began to look around him again, at the floor, everywhere. Was there something he might have still forgotten? The conviction that everything, even his memory, even common sense was departing, began to torment him unbearably. What, is it beginning already? Is my penalty approaching? Aha, that's the way it is, indeed. What caught his eye first were the frayed pieces he had cut from his trousers and strewn over the floor in the middle of the room. What is the matter with me? He cried again, like one lost. Then a strange thought occurred to him. Maybe all his clothes were bloody. Maybe there were stains all over. He could not see them, did not notice them, because his mental powers were failing, splitting up, his mind clouding. Suddenly he recalled that there had been blood on the purse too. Damn, there must be blood inside my pocket then. I stuffed the purse into my pocket while it was still wet. Instantly he turned the pocket inside out. So it was. There were blood stains on the lining. So my intellect hasn't altogether left me, so I still have a mind and a memory, after all, he thought with pride. I figured it out for myself. He inhaled deeply and joyfully. I was just weak with fever, momentarily delirious. He ripped out the whole lining of his left trouser pocket. At that moment, a shaft of sunlight fell on his left shoe. There seemed to be some traces on the bit of the sock that peeped out from his shoe. He flung off the shoes. Traces indeed. The whole edge of the sock is coated with blood. He must have been careless enough to step in the puddle. But what can I do with it now? Where can I hide the sock, this frayed part off my pants, this pocket? He gathered it all in his hand and stood in the middle of the room. In the stove? That's the first place they'd look. Burn them, but with what? I don't have any matches. No, I better go out somewhere and get rid of it. Yes, better get rid of it, he repeated, sitting down on the couch again. And right now, this minute, no delay. Instead, however, he lay head down on the pillow again. An unbearable shivering shot through him like ice. Again, he pulled the coat over him. For a long time, for several hours, he was dimly aware of sudden outbursts through his sleep. Got to go right now, right away. Get rid of it all, out of sight, soon as possible, soon as possible. He wanted to get up from the couch several times, but could not. At last, it was a loud knock on the door that wakened him. Open up, you dead or alive, snoring away as always, Natasha shouted, beating her fist against the door. Snoring away for days and days, in broad daylight, like a dog, just like a dog. Open up, huh? It's past 10. Sorry. Maybe he ain't home, a man's voice said. Damn, that's the janitor's voice. What does he want? He sat bolt upright on the couch. His heart was pounding so it hurt. Then who put the door on the latch, Natasha said. All we need now is for him to start locking himself in. Does he think somebody's going to rob him or what? Open up, my brainy one. Wake up. What do they want? Why the janitor? It's all up. Should I resist or should I open? Come what may. He stood up, bent forward, and took off the hook. The room was so small that he could take the door off the hook without leaving his bed. Damn. Natasha and the janitor were standing there. Natasha looked at him a bit strangely. He glanced at the janitor with a defiant and desperate air. Silently, the latter handed him a gray sheet of paper folded in two, sealed with bottle wax. Summons from the station, he announced, handing over the paper. What station? Police. Means they want you to show up at the station. What station is clear? Police? Why? How should I know? They ask, so you go. The janitor looked at him carefully, looked all around, and turned to go. But he's really sick, Natasha remarked. Isn't he? She did not take her eyes off him. The janitor turned his head for a moment. Been in a fever since yesterday, she added. He did not reply. He held the paper in his hands without breaking the seal. Don't bother getting up, Natasha said. Seeing him about to lift his feet from the couch, she suddenly felt sorry for him. Don't go. You're sick. It won't burn down. What's that you've got there? He looked. In his right hand he was holding the cut bits of frayed trouser, the sock, and the scraps of the ripped-out pocket. He had slept holding them like that. Afterward, he recalled that even when he half awakened during the bout of his fever, he had clasped the rags more tightly in his hand and fallen asleep like that again. Oh my, such rags he collects, and he sleeps with them like with a treasure. Natasha went off into her hysterical laughter. Instantly he stuffed everything under his coat, fixing her steadily with his eyes. Though there was little he could fully and rationally comprehend at the moment, nevertheless he sensed that a man about to be taken off would not be handled this way. But the police? Would you drink some tea? I'll bring some, eh? There's some left. No, I'll go. I'll go right now, he muttered, rising to his feet. But you couldn't get down the stairs, could you? I'll go. As you like. She followed the janitor out. Immediately he dashed to the light to examine the sock and the piece of frayed trouser. There's a stain, but not really noticeable. Everything's all dirty, torn, and faded. If you didn't know, you wouldn't notice. From a distance, Natasha couldn't have seen a thing. Thank God. He unsealed the summons with a tremor and began to read. He kept reading for quite a while, until at last it sank in. It was an ordinary summons from the district police station, asking him to appear that day at 9:30 in the office of the district superintendent. What's going on here, though? I've never had anything to do with the police. Why all of a sudden today? He thought in agonized bewilderment. Lord, let it be over as quick as possible. About to drop to his knees in prayer, he burst out laughing. Not at the prayer, but at himself. He began to dress himself hastily. If I'm through, I'm through. It doesn't matter. Suddenly he thought, I'll put on the sock. It will get dustier and the traces will disappear. As soon as he put it on, however, he tore it off again with disgust and horror. He tore it off, but realizing that he had no other, he picked it up and put it on again, and again he burst out laughing. It all depends, it's all relative, just a matter of form, he thought in a flash, but only in one corner of his mind as his body trembled all over. Well, didn't I put it on? I did, and what's that? But his laughter gave way immediately to despair. No, I won't make it, he thought. His legs were trembling. From fear, he accused himself. His head whirled and ached from fever. It's a trick. They want me to get down there and all of a sudden pull a fast one, he went on murmuring to himself as he walked out to the stairs. It's bad luck. I'm almost delirious. I might let something stupid slip out. On the stairs, he recalled leaving all the things in the hole behind the wallpaper. They probably want to search while I'm out, he reminded himself and paused. Suddenly, such despair possessed him and such indifference to his own ruin that he merely waved his hand and moved on. If they'd only just get it over with. In the street, it was unbearably hot again. Scarcely a drop of rain had fallen all these days. Again, dust, brick, and lime. Again, that stench from the stalls and the saloons. Again, the numerous drunks. The finished peddlers, the half-broken horse cabs. The sun flashed in his eyes. It hurt him to look, and his head whirled. The usual state of a man in high fever who suddenly goes out into the street on a bright sunny day. As he came to the corner that turned off into yesterday's street, he looked down at it into that house, and immediately he turned his eyes away. If they ask, maybe I'll tell them, he thought as he approached the station. The station was a few blocks away, having just been moved into a new building to the 4th floor. He had once been to the old quarters on some trifling errand, but that had been a long time ago. As he entered the gate, he saw stairs on the right and a peasant with a small book in his hands coming down them. Must be a janitor. The station must be up here. It was a guess, but he started to go up. He did not want to ask anybody about anything. As he came to the 4th floor, he thought, I'll go in, I'll fall on my knees, and I'll tell all. The stairs were narrow, steep, and wet with slops. All the kitchens of all the apartments on all 4 floors opened out on the stairs and stayed open almost all day. There was a terrible closeness. Up and down the stairs went janitors with house registers under their arms, policemen, and men with women, visitors. The station door was also wide open. He went in and paused in the anteroom. Some peasants were standing about waiting. Here, too, it was extremely close. There was, in addition, the nauseating smell of paint, still raw over the stale oil in the newly painted rooms. He decided to move on into the next room. The rooms were very small and low. Terrible impatience egged him on and on. No one noticed him. In the second room, some clerks sat writing. They were dressed not much better than himself, and they seemed a queer lot. He turned to one. What is it? He showed the summons. The clerk asked, Are you a student? He glanced at the summons. I used to be a student. The clerk looked at him, but without any curiosity. Unkempt in appearance, there seemed to be something rigid in his glance. Won't learn anything from him, Raskolnikov thought. To him, everything is the same. Go in there, to the chief clerk, he said, motioning him forward, pointing with his finger to the very last room. The room was the 4th in a row. As he entered, it was stifling and crowded, but by people somewhat better dressed than in the other rooms. Among those waiting were 2 ladies. One was in mourning, poorly dressed, sitting behind a desk opposite of the chief clerk, writing down something he dictated to her. The other woman, a woman of full figure in a purplish blotched complexion, rather luxuriously dressed and wearing a brooch on her bosom the size of a saucer, stood to one side and was waiting for something. Raskolnikov handed the chief clerk the summons. He gave it a quick look, said wait, and continued to occupy himself with the lady in mourning. Raskolnikov relaxed a little. It can't be that. Gradually he regained his confidence and began to concentrate on keeping himself in hand. If I'm stupid, if I'm not careful even about petty details, I could let it all slip out. Pity there's no air in here, he added, stifling. Heads going around more and more, brain too. He was aware of a terrible disorder within himself. He was afraid he could not keep himself under control. He tried to concentrate on something, to think of something altogether incidental, anything at all. He did not succeed. And the chief clerk interested him. He wanted to figure him out, to learn something about him from his face. A young man of about 22 with a dark, mobile face that made him seem older than his years. He was fashionably, foppishly dressed, his hair parted in a mill, all combed and pomaded, and a number of rings on his scrubbed white fingers, and a gold chain on his vest. He even addressed a few words in French to a foreigner who happened to be there, and fairly correctly too. Louisa Ivanova, would you please sit down, he said to the overdressed, purple-faced lady. She had been standing all alone, as though she would not presume to sit down on her own, although a chair was right beside her. Ik danke, she said. And quietly, with a rustle of silk, she dropped into the chair, her light blue dress trimmed with white lace billowed out around her like a balloon, and occupied almost half the room. It was scented, filling half the room, and being so strongly scented evidently embarrassed her, and although she smiled impudently and cringely at the same time, it was obvious uneasiness. At last the lady in mourning finished and began to get up. Suddenly a young police officer entered the room rather noisily, swinging his shoulders oddly at each step. He flung his cockaded cap on the table and sat down in an armchair. As soon as she saw him, the luxurious lady practically leaped from her seat, and with a special kind of rapture fell to dropping curtsies at him. The officer paid not the slightest attention to her, while she was, on the other hand, hardly dared to sit down again in his presence. He was the assistant district superintendent, and he had brownish mustaches sticking out horizontally from each side of his face. His face had remarkably delicate features, which expressed nothing special, however, except perhaps a certain arrogance. Every now and then he looked askance and with indignation at Raskolnikov, whose bearing had too little in common with his shabby dress. Raskolnikov was looking at him too directly and too long, and he felt offended. "And what do you want?" he shouted, apparently astonished that such a tramp did not cringe before the lightning-like majesty of his gage. "I received a summons," Raskolnikov somehow replied. "It's about recovering money from the student," the chief clerk, tearing himself away from his paperwork, put in hastily. "Here you are." He tossed Raskolnikov a document and pointed out the place. "Read this." "Money? What money?" thought Raskolnikov. "But that must mean it isn't that," and he quivered with joy. He suddenly felt terribly, inexpressibly relieved. It all dropped from his shoulders. "At what time, my dear sir, were you instructed to appear?" the officer shouted for some obscure reason, more and more offended. "It's 9 o'clock, and it's past 11 now." "I just received it 15 minutes ago," Raskolnikov replied loudly over his shoulder. To his surprise, he too grew angry. He even took pleasure in it. "You'd think it was enough I came here as I am, sick with fever." "Don't shout." "Who's shouting? I'm speaking quite softly, and it's you who are shouting at me. I'll have you know that I'm a student, and don't permit myself to be shouted at." The assistant superintendent was so furious he could not for the first minute say anything, but only spluttered inarticulately. He jumped to his feet. "Be silent! You are in a government office. Don't you dare be rude, sir." "You are in the government office too," cried Raskolnikov, "and not only are you shouting, you are showing disrespect to all of us by smoking a cigarette." Having said this, Raskolnikov felt an ineffable pleasure. The chief clerk looked at them with a smile. The bad-tempered officer had obviously been disconcerted. "That's no business of yours," he cried finally, with a kind of unnatural loudness. "Be so good as to make the declaration that's demanded of you. Show him, Alexander Grigorovich. There are complaints against you. You don't pay your bills. That's the fine bird you are." But Raskolnikov was no longer listening. Eagerly, he grabbed the paper, looking for the quickest possible solution to the riddle. He read it once, he read it again, he did not understand. "What does it mean?" he asked the chief clerk. "You are being asked for money according to an IOU of yours. This is a writ. You must either pay it, including all costs, expenses, etc., or submit a written declaration stating when you will be able to pay, and at the same time an undertaking not to leave the capital before you pay, and not to sell or conceal your property. The creditor is free to dispose of your property and deal with you according to the law." "But I'm not in debt to anybody." "That's not really our business. A duly and legally attested IOU for 115 rubles has been turned over to us for recovery. It was issued to you by the widow of Colgate Assessor Zarnitsyn 9 months ago. From the widow Zarnitsyn, it was passed on as tender to court counselor Sheberov. We summon you, therefore, to said declaration." "But she's my landlady." "What concern of it is of ours that she's your landlady?" The chief clerk looked at him with an indulgent, sympathetic smile, yet with a certain triumph, as though on a novice under fire for the first time, a sort of, "Well, what's it feel now" expression. But what did he care? What in the world did he care about an IOU, a writ? Was it worth worrying about? Was it even worth any consideration? He stood there, he read, he listened, he answered. He even asked an occasional question himself. But all this was done mechanically. A feeling of triumphant security, of rescue from imminent danger, filled his entire being at this moment. He did not look ahead, he did not analyze. He had no suppositions or surmises concerning the future, no doubts and no questions. It was a moment of complete, unadulterated, purely animal joy. At that very moment in the station, though, thunder and lightning struck. Still, quite shaken by the disrespect shown him, furious and obviously attempting to repair his wounded vanity, the officer hurled himself with all his thunderbolts on the unfortunate, luxurious lady, who had been looking at him from the moment he arrived with the most stupid smile. "And a fine one you are," he shouted suddenly at the top of his voice. The lady in mourning had already left. "What was going on at your place last night? Ah, scandal. Scandal for the whole street. More brawling and drunkenness. Do you want to go to jail or what? I've warned you 10 times that 11 won't do. Now you're at it again. You're a fine one, all right." The paper dropped from Raskolnikov's hands. He looked wildly at the luxurious lady who had been dealt with so unceremoniously. But he soon realized what had happened, and as soon as he did, the whole episode began to amuse him. He listened with pleasure. He wanted to laugh and laugh and laugh. His nerves were that much on edge. "Iya Petrovich," the chief clerk had begun anxiously, but stopped to bide his time. As he knew from his own experience, it was not possible to deal with the enraged officer just then except by force. As for the luxurious lady, she trembled at first before the thunder and lightning. Yet strangely, the more the abuse mounted, the more amiable she became, the more charming the smile she addressed to the dread officer. She shifted restlessly from foot to foot, and curtsied incessantly, waiting anxiously that she might at last be permitted to put in her word too. The opportunity came. "There was no commotion and no prowling by my place, Mr. Captain," she began as though scattering peas in confident, if highly Germanized Russian. "Und no scandal at all. So it was drunk as they come. Und so already about it I have it all told. But it was not mine fault. Mine house is a respectable house, Mr. Captain, and it is run respectable, and I've always don't want no kind of scandal. But they was come all drunk, and then again for the bottles they ask, and then when his feet raised on to play the piano, with his foot started, and that is not good in a respectable house, and the piano he has gone gebroke, and there is no manners here at all, and I have said this. Und this bottle he took, und everybody he started to hit me this bottle from behind. Und so the janitor I called, und Karl is come, und he is Karl taken, und I hit him, und Henriette also in the eye he hit, und me 5 times in the face. Und this is so bad manners in ein respectable house, Mr. Captain, and I am so yelling, and the window he opens up the canal, and like a pig he squeals, and this is a shame, and how it is possible through the window to the streets to squeal like a pig, like this, poof, ooh, 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 wee, poof, pwee, and Carl froze from the window by the coat has pulled them back. This is true, Mr. Captain. Und sein Lack has torn, und then he has yelled, the man's muss him find pie in 15 rubles. Und myself, I paid him, Mr. Captain, 5 rubles for sein Lack. Und this is not a respectable guest, Mr. Captain, und has all kinds of scandal made. Und I, he says, will I have a great satire on your guest route, because I can write about you in all the newspapers. That means he's a writer? Yes, Mr. Captain, and such not a respectable guest, Mr. Captain, and when he is in a respectable house. Well, enough. I have warned you, though. I have warned you. Iya Petrovich, the chief clerk proclaimed Whaley again. The officer threw him a swift glance, and the chief clerk tilted his head slightly. This is much I will tell you, most worthy Louisa Ivanova, and it is my last word, the officer went on. If a scandal takes place in your respectable house just once more, then I will personally, as I say in high society, toss you in the clink. Do you hear me? So a writer of literature, no less, took 5 rubles for getting his coat tail torn in a respectable house. That's what they are like, these writers. And he hurled a contemptuous glance at Raskolnikov. In that tavern a day before yesterday there was another story like that. This writer ate his dinner all right, and then he doesn't want to pay. I'll write you up in satire, he says, and all that stuff. Last week on the ferry there was another one. He was insulting a respectable family using the foulest language. To state, a counselor and his wife and daughter, mind you. One was kicked out of a candy shop the other day. That's what they're like, these writers. Literature, students, town, criers, to food. You better go. But I'm going to look in at your place myself sometime, and then watch out. Do you hear me? Louisa Ivanova began to curtsy in all directions with intensified gratitude. She curtsied herself right up to the doorway. In the doorway, however, she collided with an important-looking officer. He had a fresh, open face and most impressively thick, blonde sideburns. This was Nikodem Fomitch himself, the district superintendent. Louisa Ivanova made haste to curtsy practically down to the floor, and hopping along with small, rapid steps, flew out of the office. Fussel, rattle again, thunder and lightning, hurricanes and waterspouts, Nikodem Fomitch said to Ilya Petrovich in a kind, friendly way. You are boiling over again. I heard you all the way down the stairs. Well then, Ilya Petrovich, with refined nonchalance, swinging his shoulders in a picturesque manner at each step, he went over to a desk that had some papers on it. Look at this. Here's a writer, or a student, or a former student, anyway. He doesn't pay his bills, has handed out IOUs, won't clear out his apartment. Complaints coming in about him all the time. And then he has the nerve to complain that I smoke a cigarette in His Majesty's presence. They're bad actors, all of them. Just look at him. Pretty, isn't he? Poverty's no vice, old fellow, and that's about the size of it. You're famous for this. Go up like powder. Can't stand an insult. Nikodem Fomitch turned politely to Raskolnikov. No doubt something he said has offended you, and you couldn't restrain himself, he continued. But that's a mistake. Why, he's one of the finest, I tell you, one of the finest fellows. But powder, sheer powder, why, he used to lose his temper all the time, boil over, get mad, and then nothing. It would all roll off, and what was left, sir, was a heart of gold. In the regiment they used to call him Lieutenant Powder. And what a regiment it was! Ilya Petrovich exclaimed, pleased at all the flattery, but still sulking a bit. Raskolnikov suddenly wanted to say something pleasant to them. He turned suddenly at Nikodem Fomitch. Be so kind, Captain, he began quite familiarly. Put yourself in my position. If I've done anything wrong on my part, I'm ready to beg anyone's pardon. I'm a poor, sick student. Crushed. He actually used the word crushed by poverty. A former student, because at that moment I cannot support myself. But there is some money coming my way. I have a mother and a sister in Riesen province. They're going to send me some, and I will pay. My landlady is a kindly woman. She's been angry, though, because I've lost the job I had giving lessons. It's over 3 months I haven't paid her. She doesn't even send up my dinner anymore. I really don't understand what all this is about. She wants cash from my IOU. But how can I pay her, I asked you? That's really not our business, said the chief clerk. Please, I agree with you completely, but please let me explain. Raskolnikov went on, addressing himself not to the chief clerk, but entirely to Nikodem Fomitch. Yet he tried as hard as he could to include Ilya Petrovich too, even though the latter was doing his best to look occupied with various papers and contemptuously paid no attention to him. Please, let me explain my side of it. Close to 3 years now I've been living at her house, since I first arrived from the provinces. At first, well, I might as well admit it. From the very first I promised I'd marry her daughter. Nothing in writing, you understand, kind of a gentleman's agreement. This girl, anyway, I liked her, though I certainly wasn't in love, youth and all that. I mean, what I want to say is my landlady gave me a lot of credit, then I would live it up a bit. I was a bit wild. No one, my dear sir, is asking you for such intimacies, and we have no time to listen to them, broke in Ilya Petrovich, coarsely and triumphantly. With some passion, Raskolnikov continued, though speaking had suddenly become extremely difficult for him. Please, let me tell you everything, how it happened, and what... I agree with you, it's all beside the point. But a year ago, this girl died of a typhus. I stayed on as a tenant, just like before. When she was moving to her present apartment, the landlady said to me, and she said it in a friendly way, she had complete faith in me and all that, but wouldn't I give her an IOU for 115 rubles, which was what she figured I owed her. Allow me, sir, she actually said all I have to do was make out this paper and she'd be glad to give me as much credit as I wanted, and she would never ever, those were her very words, mind you, she would never make me use this paper until such time I myself could pay. Now, just when I've lost my job and don't have enough to eat, now she goes and takes legal action. What can I say? These sentimental details, my dear sir, Ilya Petrovich cut in flatly, do not concern us. You have to make a statement and sign the undertaking. As for your being in love and all these tragic touches, that is absolutely not our business. Come now, you're being a little rough, murmured Nikodem Fomitch. He had seated himself at the desk, and he too was busy signing documents. Somehow he felt ashamed. Write, please, the chief clerk said to Raskolnikov. Write what? He asked rather rudely. I will dictate to you. It seemed to Raskolnikov that after his confession, the chief clerk's manner toward him had become more casual and more contemptuous. Yet, strangely enough, he suddenly felt himself completely indifferent as to who thought what about him, and this change occurred in a moment, in a single flash. If he had felt any impulse to reflect a little, it certainly would have astonished him that he'd been talking the way he had a minute before, even trying to force his feelings on them. And where had these feelings come from? Now, if the room had suddenly turned out to be full, not of policemen, but of his closest friends, he would not have been able to address a single human word to them. So abruptly had his feelings been drained. He suddenly felt within himself a gloomy sensation of tormented infinite solitude and estrangement. It was not the humiliation of having poured his soul out before Ilya Petrovich, or the humiliation of the officer's triumph over him, that caused the sudden change of feeling. What did he care about his own baseness? All those vanities, those officers, German ladies, legal writs, offices, etc., etc. If at that moment he had been condemned to burn at the stake, he would not have blinked an eye. He would have scarcely paid any attention to the sentence. Something happened inside him he had never known before. Something entirely new, sudden, and unprecedented. Not that he had understood it, yet with every fiber of his being, he clearly sensed not only that he would not be able to turn again as he had a little while ago, with a kind of sentimental expansiveness to the people in the police station, but that he would never again be able to communicate with them about anything, not even if, instead of police unofficials, they turned out to be his blood brothers and sisters. Hi, thank you. Ah, that's cold. Thank you. I have to read this more, and then I'll be done. Just this more. Let me finish. I love you. This is bad, but don't tell him I said that. Until that moment, he had never before experienced such a strange and terrible sensation. Most painful of all, it was more sensation than it was understanding or conscious awareness, an immediate sensation, the most painful of all the sensations he had experienced in his lifetime. The chief clerk began dictating to him the usual statement in such cases, a statement to the effect that he was unable to pay, promised to do so at such and such a time, would not leave the city or sell his property or give it away, and so forth. "You can hardly write," the chief clerk noticed curiously. "The pen's falling out of your hands. Are you sick?" "Yes, the head's going around. Read on." "That's all. Just sign." The chief clerk took away the document and began to busy himself with others. Raskolnikov returned the pen. Instead of getting up and leaving, however, he put both his elbows on the desk and clasped his head in both hands. He felt as though a nail were being driven into his skull. A strange thought suddenly occurred to him. He would get up now. He would walk over to Nikodem Fomitch and tell him everything that had happened yesterday, down to the last detail. Then he would take him back to the apartment and show him what he had been hidden in the hole in the corner. The impulse was so strong he had already risen from his seat to carry it out. "Shouldn't I think it over a little?" dragged across his mind. "No, better not think about it. Better just get it off my chest." Suddenly he stopped, as though petrified. Nikodem Fomitch was saying something heatedly to Ilya Petrovich, and he caught the words. "Impossible. They'll both go free. In the first place, all contradicts himself. Just think. Why would they call the janitor if they had really done it? Why should they give themselves away, just to be cunning? No, that would have been too cunning." Finally, the janitor and this peddler woman both saw the student Pestriakov right at the gateway at the very moment he came in. He was with 3 friends, and they parted company at the gateway, and he was asking the janitors about the address while his friends were still around. Would he be asking about the address if that was what he had in mind? As for Koch, he spent half an hour with the silversmith down below. He went up to see the old woman. It was exactly 7:45 when he went up. Now just think. But excuse me, how do you account for this contradiction? They say themselves they knocked and the door was fastened. Yet 3 minutes later, when they came back with the janitor, it turns out the door was open. That's just the point. Undoubtedly the murderer was there, and he had the door on the latch. Undoubtedly they would have found him there if Koch hadn't been dumb enough to go look for the janitor himself. That was when he actually managed to get down the stairs and slip past them. Koch thanks his lucky stars. He says if I stayed there, he would have jumped out and murdered me with his axe. Now he wants to offer up a special service in church. Hee hee. But nobody saw the murderer. How could anybody see him? Asked the chief clerk, who had been listening in. The house is a veritable Noah's Ark. The case is clear. Nikodem Fomitch said heatedly. The case is clear. No, Ilya Petrovich countered. The case is anything but clear. Raskolnikov picked up his hat and walked toward the doorway, but he did not get as far as the doorway. When he came to, he noted that he was sitting in a chair. A young man on his right was holding him up. Another man on his left holding a yellow glass filled with yellowish water, and Nikodem Fomitch was standing in front of him, gazing at him steadily. He got up from the chair. "What's the matter?" Nikodem Fomitch asked rather sharply. "You ill?" He could hardly hold the pen while he signed his name. The chief clerk noted. He had taken his place again and was occupying himself with official papers. "Have you been sick a long time?" Ilya Petrovich called out. He too resumed going through the papers. Of course, he too had been staring at the sick man as long as the latter was in a faint. As soon as Raskolnikov had come to, he turned away. "Since yesterday," Raskolnikov answered. "Did you go out yesterday?" "Yes, I went out." "Even though you were sick?" "Even though I was sick." "What time?" 8 p.m. "And where, may I ask?" "Along the street." Brief and to the point. White as a sheet, Raskolnikov answered in brittle fragments without dropping his dark, dilated eyes before the gaze of Ilya Petrovich. "Look," said Nikodem Fomitch, "he can hardly stand on his feet while you—" "Never mind," said Ilya Petrovich in a rather peculiar way. Nikodem Fomitch wanted to add something, but he glanced at the chief clerk, who had been looking at him quite steadily, and he remained silent. Suddenly everyone fell silent. It was strange. "Very well, then," Ilya Petrovich concluded. "We are not keeping you." Raskolnikov went out. He could still catch the sounds of an animated conversation that sprang up as soon as he left. Most clearly he heard the questioning voice of Nikodem Fomitch. In the street he recovered himself completely. A search, now there will be a search," he kept repeating to himself as he hurried home. "The bastards, they suspect!" His former terror seized hold of him again and shook him from head to foot.